Do you know someone in foster care? Have you been in foster care? Do you have a child in foster care? Are you a grandparent or relative caring for a family member? Are you considering becoming a foster parent? Then tune in every Wednesday at 3 p.m. to Fresh Start Today on WNOV 860 AM to engage in thought-provoking conversations with families and providers about child welfare services, both locally and nationally. Together, we can save our children.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Fresh Start Today. I'm your host, Jermaine Reed, and my co-host is Sean Roby, Master Level Social Worker, and we have some phenomenal guests in the studio today. We have with us Shauna Perry Finch, Dina Radke, and Pamela Hanson are on the line, and we're going to be talking about implementing restorative practices in Milwaukee Public Schools district. So we're really excited about this conversation. There's a number of things that we would like for you all to learn and to also participate in this conversation as we journey through this next hour. It is 3:03 on Wednesday. I was going to say it's Monday, Wednesday, October the 7th. So we're doing a lot of great things here in the studio. And if you would like to join this conversation, call 414-444-5250, 414-444-5250. Good afternoon, guests.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Pamela, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, we're going to be talking about MPS, implementing restorative practices in Milwaukee Public School District. So hopefully our audience will learn several things. One, we would like for our guests to explain why MPS is converting the district over to a trauma-informed care community, and what does that mean exactly. So hopefully, Pamela, you'll be able to weigh in on that. And then also we would like to identify what restorative practices is and what is not. The next thing is, how will restorative practices benefit high-risk populations like Black males, special needs, and mentally challenged students? We also want to know, how will caregivers be engaged in this restorative process? And then finally find out what other system partners are critical to the success of the implementation of this process. So we would like to thank each of you for taking the time out this afternoon to be here on the show. And I just want to say that in beginning that a lot of schools across the country, not just in Milwaukee, not just in the state of Wisconsin, but across the country, private, public, urban, suburban, rural, parochial, in some way have turned into what appears to be like fortresses. I mean, you have a lot of folk that's patrolling the playgrounds or the hallways. We have folks in the auditoriums, folk walking through, what do you call it, locked doors, and what do you call those things that you walk through when you're trying to get into the school?
Detectors.
The protectors. I mean, it just doesn't feel like the way school felt 30 years ago. And I think we can all agree with that. So some things have changed in our society, and school environments have been impacted by those changes. So when we look at this, there are a lot of schools today where educators and administrators will still respond to punitive measures and not so much the restorative model. And we've heard, or you identify in some materials or research or some reports nationwide that the term restorative practices can be also looked at as restorative model or restorative justice, depending on the community that's referring to this restorative element. Yes, correct? Yes. Okay. And so in Milwaukee Public School Districts, we refer to it, or you all refer to it, as restorative practices. And I keep saying that for a reason, because I have to get it in my blood. It's restorative practices and not restorative justices. But there's a lot of school districts that's still holding on to that old model, because I can remember when I was going to school that if you acted out in classroom, we actually were taken into the coat room. That was a special room where there were some punitive measures that were administered by the teacher. Some of y'all might remember that that's listening to the show today.
Was that 50 years ago?
No, I'm not that old.
Oh, okay.
Just you know, and so there was that climate, but there's still some people who are holding on to that old model, that punitive model, and that's a huge cultural shift to go from a punitive model to a restorative model. And so now what we're seeing that there are more school districts across the country. I believe Illinois, Chicago, Illinois is one of them. The Oakland School District down in Miami. There are a number of schools. Colorado has some school districts that are embracing this restorative practices model, which is kind of saying that we're kind of putting aside the punitive and we're embracing more of a restorative model. Can you explain to me what is a restorative model or restorative practices?
Okay. So restorative practices is more so a framework or philosophy. It's not a program where you have something that's scripted that you have to do. But when you're operating out of this framework, what does that look like? There's certain assumptions that we make about people in general, right? Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about restorative practices, the kind of assumptions that we're making is that everyone is needed for what they bring. So envision a classroom. And you may have some students in that classroom who are disruptive. Those students who are showing some disruptive behaviors at that time are still needed to be a part of that classroom. We need them. That everyone is holistic, which ties into our educating the whole child concept that we're talking about, meaning that we're not just our academic side, but we're also our social side. That everyone is needed for what they bring. Right? And that we're all interconnected. Everyone who's in that classroom is in some way or shape or form interconnected, or in that school building. In this district, we're all interconnected. Okay.
Community. It's a community concept. Okay.
Yes.
Everybody brings value to that community.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me start, and I appreciate you kind of explaining what restorative practices, what that means at its base. There's a couple things I want to kind of talk about in terms of what we know, and I think it's foundational information that's going to help guide this conversation. A report was published back in March 2015 from the University of Los Angeles, and that report found that K-12 schools in Wisconsin suspend black high school students at a higher rate than anywhere else in the country, and has the second highest disparity in suspension rates between African American students and Caucasian students. Milwaukee being the state's biggest city, according to this report, suspends black high school students at a rate nearly double the national average, according again to UCLA. Wisconsin also has the largest achievement gap between black students and white students, when you compare to what's going on in the country as a whole, and ranks last in reading comprehension tests among black fourth graders. Milwaukee has the most black students in the state, and is the biggest contributor, according to that document, to Wisconsin's achievement gap. Okay? We also know that suspensions, typically they don't work. They result in alienation and often early involvement with the juvenile justice system. UCLA Civil Rights Project found that schools with high suspension rates are less safe, less equitable, have lower academic outcomes, and has a disproportionately negative impact, again, on students of color. We also know that children who are exposed to a significant amount of trauma and toxic stress daily are still expected to excel academically. Are we in agreement with that? Is that true? Mm-hmm. We also know that trauma impacts individuals neurologically, socially, physically, and behaviorally. So those are some of the things that we know based on the data that's out there. And so when you start talking about implementing restorative practices into the school environment, hopefully we'll be able to see how some of these outcomes or these things that folks are reporting can be positively impacted by the implementation of restorative practices. So you've explained what restorative practice is. Can you kind of talk about to me what is the motivation behind implementing restorative practice? What is the motivation here?
Well, I think one thing that we're finding, as you had shared in the data, is that punitive approaches aren't working. We're not getting the results that we're looking for. And so we're looking to make a shift into operating out of a more restorative framework. And when I say that framework, being clear about relationships, because that's kind of like the basis of restorative practices, is that we value relationships, all relationships. And in valuing those relationships, how do we interact with one another? So if you're in a school community, it's not just one entity in that community that should have a voice, because we're not going to get the results that we're looking for if it's one entity. That one entity, meaning teachers in that building or students in that building, it has to be a collective of voices, right? And so restorative practices speaks to that, when I talk about how every voice is important, right? And building those relationships.
So restorative practice is giving every individual in that community a voice.
Yes. And so that's how that connects when we're talking about African American, no matter what the color of the student is or the ethnicity of the student. If every voice is valued, then with every voice being valued, then we take that into consideration into what we're doing and what our goal is in the educational system. We still have to educate our students, but we also want to know they can help us learn how to best educate them when we have that dialogue that can take place.
Okay, and so when you talk about that, implementing restorative practices will help all students. I agree with you, because I think if African American children are functioning at the bottom of the rung, if their outcomes are so dismal, that if we focus on helping that population of children, everybody rise. If you improve it for the population that's not thriving, then ultimately those folk who are thriving will do better. And so I agree with you. I think that, that's that everybody has a voice, everybody has some input, and since we know that the data out there speaks to that African American males particularly have a high suspension rate, I don't know about expulsion, but suspension rates in a lot of urban districts, across the country, that we really have to find a way how to reach that population, because we do know, according to national data as well, that folks who are suspended on a more frequent basis, it increases their likelihood they're going to disengage from the educational process and possibly become connected, or more likely to become connected, with the criminal justice system. So that's why it's really important. Then we look at the number of African American males who are incarcerated. And I was looking at a study that was funded by Bill Gates Foundation, and it's called The Silent Epidemic. And according to them, about 75% of America's state prison inmates, almost 59% of federal inmates, and 69% of jail inmates did not complete high school. And that's why that's really important. Because if suspension is increasing the likelihood that individuals become disconnected from the educational process and drop out of school and more likely to go to prison, if we want to reduce the prison population, then we have to focus on increasing the high school graduation rate. And the way we can increase the high school graduation rate is to eliminate or significantly reduce the suspension rate.
Yes.
Okay? So Pamela, good afternoon. Pamela, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you talk about, yes, I can hear you. Can you kind of talk a little about what it means for a school district to transition into becoming a trauma-informed care community?
Yes, and it actually has a lot of overlap with restorative practices.
Okay.
Again, with being trauma-informed, we want to first be able to recognize that we have students as well as staff who may have experienced trauma. So we want to first be able to have an understanding of trauma. We want to understand its prevalence and how common it is for many of our students, and again, like I said, our staff, as well as our students' families. From there, we really want to begin to have individuals to adopt what we call a perspective shift. So that would be adopting what we call the trauma-informed lens. So beginning to look at our students differently, looking at those behaviors differently, and not necessarily assuming that students are willfully defiant or are just trying to get under our skin, the teacher's skin, but just really trying to understand kind of where they are and how we can help move them forward.
So basically looking at the root of the behavior.
Right.
Is what you're trying to get, the explanation. Okay, where's this coming from?
Right. We want to understand that, and understand that they may have some trauma in their history that may have brought some of those behaviors forward. Okay. And not all students may have exhibit I guess, outward behaviors, but some of our students actually have some internalizing behaviors as well.
Right.
So we have to be able to recognize some of that in our students and, again, try to help move forward. And a lot of about being trauma sensitive, very similar to restorative practices, that we have to revalue our relationships. So at the core or the crux of being trauma sensitive, we have to value relationships and be willing to build relationships and school connectedness. So as you were talking about students who are suspended, we of course want to make sure that we're welcoming our students in our schools and making them feel safe when they're in our school setting.
Okay, and so that's what is involved in making a district trauma informed or operating through a trauma. So whenever you see the behavior, you want to ask the question, why, or where's this behavior come from? What are some of the questions that you think that a teacher would be asking when they see certain behaviors?
Well, when we think of the trauma-informed lens, we usually ask the question of what happened versus what's wrong with you.
Okay.
We kind of want to understand, again, where, again, things are with that particular student. So we don't want to put blame on students. We want to really come from that lens of understanding what's going on with them.
How do you I guess assess to see whether something is trauma, a behavior is trauma based? I mean, because can that be used as a pass for some kids to say, okay, you know, I've had a bad day, or, you know, I didn't get something for my birthday yesterday. Is that trauma or is that disappointment? And, you know, how do you look at that differently? Because I can be disappointed that, you know, my mother didn't give me $5 this morning, so now I'm going off in the classroom. I've done something that I shouldn't have done, or I've violated a rule. I mean, is that really trauma, or is that just life?
Right. And when we're looking at being a trauma-sensitive school, we don't typically have to know whether a student has been traumatized.
Okay.
We want to really kind of look at it as if students may have been traumatized. How would we want to treat someone if we did know that they were traumatized?
Okay.
And of course, we want to create a culture that is safe for our students as well as our staff. We want to build trust with our students. Give them some choices so that they aren't feeling that everything is just kind of put on them or they're told what to do. We want to really kind of work and collaborating with those students as well as the staff members to help really make them move, like I said, forward, so that they're feeling like they're a part of the school and not that we're trying to kind of put them elsewhere. We want to create a culture of safety, and when we say safety, we want to make sure that individuals feel both physically safe, but we also want to have that emotional safety as well.
Right.
Okay. So obviously there are a number of components in play when you start talking about transitioning a district or helping a district transform into a trauma-informed district. There's a number of components. And can you talk about what some of those components are? Because restorative practices is just one of those type of components. So are there any other components that are essential in making a district a trauma-informed community?
Again, I would probably refer back to that relationship building. That's probably one of those fundamental principles of being trauma-informed. Is we want to develop relationships not only with the students, but we want the students to have relationships with one another, as well as having staff members have relationships with one another. And of course, those are positive relationships that we want everyone to have. Again, establishing that sense of safety in the school setting. We want to really empower our students and build on their skills of resilience, or help them to develop skills of resilience. So there are definitely a lot of different components that are involved in creating a trauma-sensitive school. So it is a process.
Okay. Well,
now, you know, excuse me, Pamela, or for either of you, when you talk about this collective approach from the educational side, but how's this program or practice incorporating the parents? because in order for kids to succeed, you know, in a lot of respects, in many respects, it starts at home. So how are you all getting parents to buy into this practice?
Well, you know, that question makes me want to back up a little bit, because when we're talking about restorative practices, hence that the term practices, we're talking about a variety of things that we can do in a restorative way. What's most common is circles. You know, that's what people refer to as sitting in circles. They refer to whether that's sitting in circles to build community or when repairing harm, right, when something has happened. But when we're talking about operating truly from a restorative lens, is how does that person operate when they're sitting in circle or when they're not? And when we're talking about parents or whoever that is that we're talking to people like they're valuable. We're talking to people like we need them. We need our parents, right? And we need our community partners.
But I'm assuming we've always talked to parents that way in school districts across the country. I mean, is this something new, or is that something that should be a given? That we should just respect each other. If we're talking about relationship building, that should be normal.
And that really, restorative practices is that grassroots stuff. This was out long before any of us were living.
Right.
It is going back to the roots, because in the midst of what can be chaos, what could be trauma, what could be difficulty, what could be struggle, sometimes we lose our way. Right? Just as people. And so having those opportunities to come back, restorative practices is one of those lenses to help us come back to our foundation.
Gotcha. Well, what I want to do is take a break right now. It's 3:24 in the afternoon. You're listening to Fresh Start Today, and we're talking with some guests from the Milwaukee Public School System regarding implementing restorative practices in the MPS school district. So we'll be right back after this break.
Do you know what Nelson Mandela, Andrew Jackson, Malcolm X, and Steve Jobs have in common? Each of these individuals were world leaders who were once in foster care. We often hear about the road from foster care to prison, but did you know there's another road from foster care to a world stage? Fresh Start Family Services is looking for adults to become licensed foster parents. Every child needs a caring adult in their lives. Wouldn't it be great if you could foster or adopt the next world leader? For more information on how you can become licensed with Fresh Start, please call 414-351-1100. That is 351-1100.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Fresh Start Today. It's 3:30 in the afternoon, and we have in the studio with us today Ms. Dina Radke, Shauna Perry Finch, and Pamela Hanson on the line. They're from the Milwaukee Public School District, and we're talking about implementing restorative practices in the Milwaukee Public School District. Now, this whole thing around restorative practices, you just explained kind of like what that concept is and what are some of the valuable components or the essential components in transforming the school district from where it is now to a trauma-informed school district. The question that I have for you is, can you kind of tell us what the historical outline looked like for MPS's implementing restorative practices?
Yeah. Our history goes back, to my knowledge, about 10 years, and it really came out of some requests from some of our school social workers who were interested in this work. And we had the opportunity to work with David Lerman, who worked with the district attorney's office, who was just a huge, his passion around this work was amazing. And so he really kind of started the fire, I think, in the work that we were doing. And as I mentioned earlier, it really kind of started as a grassroots venture. It spread. There's a number of people who have really embraced that work. We've had professional learning communities with our social workers and school psychologists who then bring that back to their buildings and help implement that work in their buildings. We've had quite a bit of training, I would say, over the years, and it's just really grown into a point right now where we have some schools who use a restorative model, just school-wide. It just is how they operate.
What are some of those schools?
Alliance High School is one of them. Audubon High School is another one, and Transition High School. All use that as a foundation for the work that they do.
Okay, so you all have been implementing this now for 10 years, correct? Since you said
I would say on various levels.
Very low. Yeah. And you're continuing to add more fuel and resources so that this can now become a district-wide practice?
We're working towards that. You know, the word grassroots was used at one point. So, you know, and it being that's how it started, right? And it's still emerging that way, because it's one of those things you can't teach someone necessarily to be restorative, because it's a framework, right? And so you have to take them on a journey to be willing to consider that, and where do they fit in that space for them.
Okay.
And that's different from here's a structured curriculum that you can use. Here's what you're supposed to say and when you're supposed to say it.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you're supposed to do specifically. That's not what we're talking about with restorative practices.
So
right?
more so starting where that student is and kind of going from there.
Not just students, staff
too.
Administration,
Mm-hmm.
right? Every person who is involved with that young person in that building,
Right.
right? It has to be willing to consider operating out of this practice. I could stand up and say, this is what restorative practices is. This is actually how you do it, because people are very interested in practices.
Mm-hmm.
But before the practices, what does it mean to operate out of that framework? I have to continuously keep coming back to that, because that's where it lies. For example, the principal at Martin Luther King School, he
Mm-hmm.
refers to his students as scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And so he uses that term throughout his,
Mm-hmm.
conversations with staff and with students. That's operating from a restorative lens. To even use that term, scholars, what does it mean? Because unfortunately, what the students mean sometimes to some people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that shift in perspective, that
Right.
helps with making that shift.
Strengths
If I showed you a
perspective.
continuum of restorative practices, which has informal practices on it,
Mm-hmm.
like using affective statements and affective questions,
Mm-hmm.
and the circle work is on there, you wouldn't see scholar on there. You wouldn't see that. But when you operate from the framework, it's certain things that you naturally do.
Mm-hmm.
I think about when I was at Transition High School, and there was a student there who had an emotional behavioral disability. And this is a school for students who are at a high risk level, maybe returning from incarceration, maybe returning from expulsion. This student was one of the best artists that I've ever seen. This student got a full ride to MyAd. Right in Milwaukee,
Wow.
after going to a pre-college program. And being in that restorative environment, what's already in you, how
Mhm.
it gets an opportunity to grow. And so how some other behaviors subsided, right? Just like how we can accommodate. We all have our deficiencies, right?
Right.
And how we learn to accommodate for those as we get older, and what that student was able to do. Restorative practices helps to bring that out of our young people.
Well, we have a caller online by the name of Marilyn, and before we take her call, or when we get finished taking her call, Shauna, if you can kind of let us know, what are some of the measures that you all take to work with some special needs population? Because you just mentioned this one gentleman, but I'm thinking in terms of a foster care population, in terms of population where a child may have some emotional disturbances or disorders, mood disorders, autism may be one, some speech language deficits, attachment disorders. Are there special strategies that you all implement or things that you all take in consideration when working with certain groups of children? Marilyn, you are on Fresh Start today.
Yes, I'm calling because at least 20 or 25 years ago, there were a lot of studies that had to do with black kids. I can't remember the name of the author. They used to do a lot of studying on it. I think it was Kwanzaa.
Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu? Dr. Jawanza
Yes.
Kunjufu?
Yes, and this was like, he was saying that they started out, the black kids, we starting out at the same rate and level prior to preschool, and then when they get to third grade, something happens different, and so I just was wondering if they studied this, to see what it is that happens between that period of time. You know what I'm saying? So I'm saying that it's not necessarily where the kids come from at home necessarily.
Okay.
All of it. That it's something else too. You know what I'm saying?
So there could be something in the educational environment in terms of how teachers and administrators look at students.
Yes.
That perspective, and there's studies that talk about that as well. How there was some study, and I think it actually came out of Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu book, is the one dealing with special education. But it's talking about there was some study that was done. It was saying that when teachers were surveyed, that they kind of expected certain behaviors from certain black children, or that certain black children were not going to succeed academically, and so they responded to them differently.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Marilyn. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you.
So in terms of You know, the restorative practices work with special needs population, and some of those populations I just kind of talked about. Are there certain things that you all take in consideration? Because I know you talk about valuing the person, you know, and I just don't know, how does that look when you're working with folks who have special needs or unique sets of needs?
The framework and the practices are the same.
Okay.
The difference may be in how you use those practices.
Okay.
For example, if you have a circle that is on, you're using circle to teach math. You can do curriculum circles and use that circle process to teach math. You're teaching that math in a special education room where there are some specific needs that needs to be addressed around math. You can still use that process to teach that, and it may look different in a pre-calculus class, right? The material may look different, but the concepts remain the same, no matter who it is, who the students are, what their needs are. And because the concepts still come back to the roots of, this is the population that I'm working with, and how can I support this population? How can I learn from this population, right? And so that I can help them make the most out of their academic experience, or get what they need from here academically, but also socially.
Now,
right?
when you mention circles, just for our listeners,
Yes.
What do you mean by circles?
Well, circles is the most common form of restorative practices, and there's a variety of ways that circles can be used. You can use circles in small group work as a school social worker. I've had girls groups and used the circle process to build those relationships and to teach whatever it is we're looking to teach. Because as a social worker, I'm more so teaching things on a social level, right? But as a teacher, they're teaching things on more of an academic level. So circles, you're actually sitting in circle. You may have chairs that are sitting that way. You try not to have any desks that are blocking, because it can just change the dynamic that you're trying to create in that room. You have a centerpiece, which is a place where you can focus your attention and should be something of value. I tend to use a unity statue. I learned that from Derek Rogers at Transition High School. If you've ever seen one of those pieces, it's beautiful. You also have these talking pieces that you use, right? And so whoever has that talking piece is the person who's speaking. Everyone else is listening. Should also be something of value. Okay. Some people refer to a term using guidelines. I refer to the term as shared agreements. And there are a set of things that we're personally willing to do in our time together. And so that's a way that we have to start out. There's certain things that are structured in circle, but I would say it's not a rigid practice. Right. Because we want people to be held to a high level of accountability, and we also want to provide a high level of support.
So those foundational pieces hold, like you were saying, everybody accountable.
Yes. We can hold ourselves accountable, and we also have each other to hold.
It evens the playing field. Everyone's in the same situation. Everybody then has equal voice in that setting, which is really important to the process.
Because what you say is important, and what I share is important as well.
Yeah. Let me bring up something that Toni Morrison, kind of what you are saying puts me in mind of something that Toni Morrison commented on back in 2007, and one is that human beings are relational and thrive in contexts of social engagement over control. So how does that look? Parent-child, employer-employee, school board principals, teachers, students, other peers. If we take it outside of the educational environment, we can go pastor, congregants. Relationships, there is a control element that's connected to relationships. When you talk about, Dina, leveling the playing field, Shauna, you talking about giving everyone voice and valuing that voice, accountability. How does restorative practice address control factors in school? Because somebody has to be in control. And is restorative practices, does that replace punitive measure? Is it ever appropriate to have punitive measures? You know, if a student sexually assaults another student, do we sit in a circle and focus on the unity statue and say, let's talk about this? Or how do we deal with that? Because the reality is we have a lot of violence in American schools, and we're all susceptible to it. How do you all determine when it's time to sit in a circle and when it's time to suspend you and then have a re-entry back into the community? Right. How does that look? And then we're going to take a call from my friend JT. Just a minute, JT. We're going to take your call in a minute.
Well, you know, one thing I have to say is that it reminds me of a true story. I don't know if you heard the story of Mary Johnson and O'Shea Israel. out of Minnesota?
No, talk to us.
So when O'Shea was 16 years old, he shot and killed Mary Johnson's only son. And so he had to go through trial, punitive, right? He had to go. He ended up getting jail time,
Sentence.
right? So somewhere along the way in that process, that he had was already in jail, already had gotten sentenced. Someone came up to him and said, "Hey, you know, we got this restorative justice piece that we're doing. We're trying to try out. It would mean you talking with Mary Johnson. What do you think about doing that?" What do you think he said?
I said no at first.
He said no. They went to Mary Johnson and they said, "You know, we got this restorative justice piece and we want to have you talk with O'Shea." What do you think she said? No. Over time, they'll continue to explain what this was about. This process. Because it's not something that you can put in a 1 or 2 sentence and be done. It's bigger than that.
Right.
And so it takes time. But over time, they ended up having some circles, a variety of circles. Now, last time I checked, they spoke at Transition. That's the school I was at for a few years, so that's why that comes up twice, about the power of forgiveness. O'Shea says that he's able to live again because he had been forgiven.
Wow.
By the mother of the son whose life he taken. Mary Johnson said, "I was able to live again because I was able to forgive." So when you ask the question, there are punitive practices that are going to take place. We can't get rid of. They have a place in a space. But did O'Shea going to jail fix?
Rehabilitation. Yeah.
Did that help him? Did that fix the problem? Did Mary feel like, okay, he's in jail now, I can live again? That's not what she said. Right?
Johnny
she said,
continue
I can live
to get
again now because
suspended,
I don't have that
fixed
on my heart. I can forgive. Do you know that they live side by side in a townhouse in Minnesota?
Wow.
I'm not kidding.
That's powerful.
That's powerful.
JT, you're on Fresh Start today.
Hello.
Hey, JT, how are you doing?
Hey, how you doing, young man?
I'm all right, my friend. What's on your mind?
Hey, good afternoon to your guests.
Good afternoon, JT. Hello.
They got number love for you. Hey, thank you, school teachers. The reason why I'm saying that.
Thank you.
I'm a product of a school system, public school system. I'm a product of that. My kids are part of that. My grandkids are part of that.
Oh, that's excellent.
Awesome.
So I'm saying, want to say, you know, since we've been having these crazy people in the legislature and stuff like that, and Madison and stuff like that, giving you a bad name and stuff like that, all that kind of stuff. I want to say I love you very much and thank you, school teachers, for being there and doing the best you can to teach our kids the best you can, all by all means necessary. And what I want to say on that tip is, what I was going to say is, first of all, thank you very much, because when you have these Republicans Republicans, Nazi, whatever the case may be, taking over the legislature and trying to take away everything from the school teachers, the best people I want to know my whole life. Hey, I said I made it, my kids made it, my grandkids made it. So ain't got nothing but love for you.
All right.
JT.
Thanks a lot, JT. Appreciate you listening. So now, in 2006, California initiated their restorative justice, restorative practice, restorative model. And it took 6 or 7 years for them to see some really amazing outcomes, like a significant reduction in suspension rates, just a sense of respect in that community, the education community. I'm wondering, when I think about the challenges, because anytime you're talking about a paradigm shift, changing your perspective, how you look at things, especially when there's been a zero tolerance model, and now you're swinging, as you indicated, Dina, the pendulum all the way to a restorative model. That's a big shift for a lot of people. And so when we look at this, you know, I think about Chicago public school system, their CEO, I'm not sure she's still in that position now, but I know she gave a resignation, Barbara Byrd Bennett, where the teachers were really concerned about the infrastructure, not having the infrastructure or systems in place to implement this new, as they called it, a code of conduct, this discipline policy, this huge shift and change from suspension to let's sit down and let's talk about this. So when you look at that, reality, there's going to be some challenges. What challenges have you all had to deal with, and how were you able to overcome those challenges? And then we'll take a call from Nicole. Nicole, if you can hold on.
That's a big question. Yeah. And so I think with Milwaukee, we've really embraced the pendulum. And our current superintendent has really focused on, in her work, educating the whole child. And that really gets at this work. So in terms of the support and sort of that infrastructure, I mean, a good example is sitting right next to me. So Shauna, her role in restorative practices is really made possible because there's been a concerted effort to fund that position. Pam, who's on the line, same kind of thing. So there's value in the work and value in supporting the work. And so that to me is very telling in terms of the direction that we're going, moving from that grassroots. And I think there was a lot of value in that as well. But we've really come to a point where we're supporting those efforts in a much different way to make it become more of a reality district-wide. So I would say challenges, some of it is just, timing and resources, and how do you go from, is it the right time to do that? And so in a day of zero tolerance, I'm not sure that it was the right time to do that. But I feel like a lot of those pieces have come together to make this much more of a reality moving forward.
Well, hopefully when we talk about goals, and I'm going to take Nicole's call, and so after we take Nicole's call, I want you all to prepare to talk about, this is an educational environment, so hopefully this restorative practice is going to translate to something academically. That's what I want, and if we've been implementing this gradually over the course of the last 10 years, and you've identified 3 settings where they're implementing this, what are some of those outcomes looking like, promising outcomes, which will encourage that we need to promote this or have this promoted throughout the entire district? Nicole, you're on Fresh Start Today.
Oh, thank you for taking my call, and I just thank you for this program, and also appreciate the work that these ladies are doing.
Yes.
Because I went to high school leaving from Puerto Rico on my senior year to Chicago as an example of a public school that's really till this day, I don't know how many years later, that's like 30 years later. It's a horrible school. And I remember going to my guidance counselor, and I would knock on her door every day. I want to go to college. She would ignore me. And it's funny that my older son went to South Division High School, and one of his counselors says, "You're not going to amount to much." And my son ended up getting a master's degree. He's one of the very few students that had pursued higher education coming out of South Division. And my point is, I think it's very important what type of counselors you have in the public school setting and how they interact with our children. That should have never been tolerated. I remember my younger son, when they had the zero tolerance, he's 20 now. So, I haven't been a parent of a public school setting in a long time. And he'd get suspended for talking. And he was only like 8 years old. So I had to yank him out of there and put him in a private school. And then there was no more issues with him. So I think it's very devastating. And I had seen something that they had a videotape on Facebook of a black couple that her 3-year-old son had hit the teacher, maybe like not in a very aggressive way, but he got suspended, a 3-year-old. So they were talking about how they had all these excessive suspensions of children of color versus white children. And, and if you're going to start a pipeline of all this misbehavior, of all this documentation against a child, what kind of hope would he have? So I think that should never happen, and this restorative way of looking at children is very, to me, that's helpful, and I thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. We're talking, Shauna, about how does this translate to academics, improving test scores, reading and math scores, and graduation rates? How does it translate, and what have you seen so far?
Well, I think one of the things we're learning, even when we talk about educating the whole child, our superintendent's message, and talking about being more trauma-informed and how we can support our students. And one thing we didn't mention also was social-emotional learning, right, and those 5 competency areas, and how are we helping students to be more self-aware.
What are those 5 competency areas? Share with the audience.
Self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making. There's 2 more I'm blanking out on.
Me too.
Pamela?
Yeah, Pamela.
Okay, we'll come back to it. So there's 5 social.
Let her say. She knows them. Say it, Pam.
I was just trying to remember what you said. Okay. You said self-awareness, social awareness, self-management. responsible decision making.
Yeah.
Did I get
So,
four?
well, if you think of it, just let us know. Just chime in and say, this is one of those awarenesses. So.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's not just about the books, right?
Okay.
Because if a student doesn't know how to say, I'm hungry, if a student doesn't know how to or can't address what that need is that they have, then we have a responsibility to help them try to figure out what that need is, right?
So is that time consuming? Because for
it,
some folks, I mean, we talking about, I don't know if because you say it's not just about the books, but in school, books are a big part of that.
Yes,
testing is a big part of that.
But time consuming, I mean, it's time consuming to have students in and out of your classroom if they're absent because their needs aren't met, if they're suspended.
Right.
Your time is much better spent if students have the skills and resiliency levels to operate in a much better way in school because they're ready to learn. If you have students who are not ready to learn, that's time consuming too. We're dealing with that one way or the other. The way that we're looking at it, the outcomes for students would be much higher in many levels of their life.
Because kids will be in the classes, that means they'll get more education, which means there'll be more social learning, which means there'll be more self-awareness versus being roaming the streets, playing video games.
Exactly.
But I'm thinking about these healing circles. So I'm not clear in terms of when these take place, but do they just stop in the middle of
a healing circle?
A talking circle, healing circle from the indigenous community? It's this concept, this strategy that they use in restorative practices where all these key folk who have been either affected by the decision that this person has done, if it was a behavior, that we're bringing all these folks, social workers, teachers, other students, sitting down in a circle with that map that you just talked about in the middle of that map, and put that unity candle or whatever rocks and whatever it is that you said that you put in the middle of the circle. How much time does it take? Because if my child is in this classroom, and I understand you're talking about educating the whole child, but little Bobby he got a lot that's going on at home or out in the community. Maybe perhaps daddy was arrested yesterday. Maybe perhaps a student or friend of his was killed. You know, these realities that they deal with, hasn't eaten, you know, and they're walking in the classroom and it's hard to learn, or they just was removed from their family and placed in foster care. You know, that can be a traumatic event. And so now he's bringing all of that into the classroom with him. My child has nothing to do with that. And so now we have to stop the learning process to have a healing circle. I mean, and the reason why I ask about that, because some of the critics in Chicago and some other parts of the country, that's what the big concern was right there, was that, you know, it is time consuming, they thought. So I'm wondering, how do we balance that where, yes, we're helping Bobby, but we don't want Mary to lose out in the process too, because she's thriving.
Right. You know, it depends on how you use the circle. And
Gotcha.
There's a sense, you know, there's a sense of professionalism that comes with it that our teachers have. And so what I do when I'm working with teachers is I give them information on what restorative practices is. I give them some ideas on how they may want to use it, but then a teacher determines how they best need to use it because they know the culture of their classroom. And I'm not to step into their space and say, you do it this way and you do it at this time.
Right.
That's not my space to do that, and that would be doing a disservice to those students. So again, coming back to math, could you sit in a U shape, and could you be given a math lesson, and then at the end of that lesson, could you do a check-in circle and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you with the information that you received, or how comfortable are you with doing the homework that you have to do tonight based on what you learned, right? And just asking those kind of questions, building that community in that class.
Right. So, to your point, restorative practices are not just something that's used to address discipline issues, but you also can present a lesson plan.
Yes.
Okay, that encourages community. Well, that's great. That's great. So that's what we want to know. So my question, because I know we only have a few minutes, but when we talk about discipline or something has gone wrong, and now we're going to have whatever kind of circle you want to call this circle, call it the circle. How do you control for confidentiality?
That's a part of those shared agreements.
That's part of those shared agreements.
Right.
Okay, and so what are some of the things that can be on a shared agreement? Because if the student says, okay, well, my brother touched me yesterday.
Yes.
You know, and now they've shared this in a circle. Yes. How would you manage that?
We still have to follow our procedures on what we have to do to protect children.
Which is mandatory reporting.
Mandatory reporting.
Okay, so a circle does not take the place of mandatory reporting.
It cannot.
Gotcha. Okay, and that's really important to know. Okay, so I guess the last question I'm going to have in this 3:57 on Wednesday, and we have in the studio with us Shauna Perry-Finch, Dina Radke, and Pamela Hanson from Milwaukee Public School. And we've been talking about implementing the restorative practice guideline. Is there a caller on the line? Mr. Roby just told me there's a caller on the line. My fault. So, the goals. What are the overall goals? If you can give me 3 goals of implementing restorative practice, what are those 3 goals?
Well, one I would say is that, you know, as Dina had mentioned, that we're again still grassroots and still growing this. We have some opportunities that are arising for us where we're going to be trying to do some work in some of our high schools and middle schools. It's all around this educating the whole child. And so the first part of that plan is making sure that our staff really have a clear understanding of what trauma is and how it can impact not only our students but our parents and ourselves. And then from that, diving into restorative practices from a social emotional learning perspective, right? And how can we use those practices in the middle and high school?
Okay, and so I'm hoping that you also see increasing graduation rates, and that schools become safer, and that we see a reduction in suspension and expulsion of all children. I think that will really be great. But if parents want to reach out to you, if they want to learn more about this program, how can they reach you all?
So if a parent wants to reach out, they could contact me. My name is Shauna Perry-Finch. I can be reached at 414-874-8407 if you have any questions. And there's been, you know, there's some work that is already happening with parents, but I also will say that we still have some work to do, and we value your input.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming to Fresh Start today, Dina, Shauna, and Pamela. And thank you all for listening today out there in Radio Land. Have a great week. Be safe. Be well.